Okay, awesome. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our recent or our latest Kumi Now online gathering. Our topic today will be on international law and apartheid, and we have the pleasure of being joined by Jeff Halper. Jeff is a longtime friend of Sabeel, and we're always grateful to have him on our calls. Jeff is an anthropologist, author, lecturer, and political activist, and he's also the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Maybe he can talk a little bit more about the organization. He's also the co-founder of the One Democratic State campaign. And I know a lot has happened on the ground and also
Mm.
regionally. So thank you for joining us during these depressing times. And we appreciate, giving the time and to speak with us on this topic. So we're hoping you can also speak on recent developments on the ground as well in regards to international law and apartheid. So welcome, Jeff. You may begin your presentation, and maybe after you speak, we can have a bit of a Q&A.
Sure. All right. Well, thanks for having me. No, I've worked with Sabeel for years and years and years and years. I know Naeem, of course, very well, and Jonathan and Omar and the whole crew. So, it's in-house kind of a gathering right now. Yeah, and I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And so, we're both on the ground. So my anthropology is really important, if I can give a plug to anthropology, because, anthropology goes from the micro to the macro. So, going, and experiencing a house demolition with a family on the ground and the demolition itself and the soldiers and the bulldozer and resisting as ever way I can, and looking at the family's reaction, what happens to the families later, and the ripple effects in the community, that's very powerful. You really begin to understand the human part of this, the suffering and so on. Um, but at the same time, of course, you have to ask the question. See, the problem is an activist would kind of stay there. An activist would go fight the army and go from demolition to demolition to demolition. The question is, how do you end demolitions? And the bigger question is, how do you end Israeli apartheid and and try to find, try to resolve this in a way that Palestinians have their rights restored and their properties and their national self-determination. So, you can't just end at a tragic thing and just protest it. You've got to go beyond that. And so what anthropology kind of lets me do is put that demolition into a context. Why is Israel demolishing this house or in this area? Are there patterns to demolitions? What are Israel's intentions in terms of demolitions? Because it's well known. I mean, negotiators say this all the time. I don't care what you say. I want to see what you're doing. So Israel can talk about the two-state solution and we want peace and we're fighting terrorism and all this stuff. But what is it really doing on the ground? How does house demolition, fit in with the idea that we're simply fighting terrorism? This is all for security. When they're demolishing homes of innocent people that simply have a right, a human right to a home that Israel denies. So, being an anthropologist, I'm able to sort of connect the micro and the macro, go from this particular family's experience to why this is happening, and then go back to other demolitions and put them in a context as well. So, I guess the reason I'm saying this is my analysis then is grounded. It isn't simply a theory or something I read in a book or an opinion. Um, uh, you know, uh, it really comes from years and years of being on the ground in the occupation, living in Israel now for 52 years and counting. And of course, then having that academic background. Uh, so, um, having said that, we have to step back and understand what do we mean by apartheid exactly, and uh, and where's it coming from? And in many ways, there are a lot of similarities between Israel and South Africa. I mean, there's a lot of differences as well. Certainly, I'm not making any one-to-one correlation, but we learn a lot from South Africa and Israel. And you've probably heard this before, but it really hasn't been unpacked enough. Zionism is a form of settler colonialism. And of course, that was the kind of colonialism that South Africa experienced with the Boers, with the English settlers, and so on. Uh, so that Zionism came into Palestine, uh, at the turn of the 20th century, with the intention of taking it over. The Jews did not come. Now, I'm not minimizing the connection between the Jews in this country. Where it is different is that, this isn't a story of an English farmer that gets up one morning and decides to go to South Africa because there he can have cheap land and cheap labor and get rich. That was not the motivation. There was a genuine tie, and there is. I mean, I'm here, so there's a subtext, between the Jewish people in this country. So by calling Israelis settlers, I'm not delegitimizing that tie. I'm simply saying this, that Zionism came out of two impulses. One was, of course, um, a reaction, especially to the persecutions in Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Russia in particular. In the 1880s, that was really what drove most of the Jews west to the United States at that time, the 80s and 90s and so on. So that was a piece of it. But more than that, actually, Zionism was a part of a whole revival of ethno-nationalism in Eastern Europe, in the Ukraine, I mean, Eastern Europe is still in the grips of ethno-nationalism. You look at Russia, you look at Orban in Hungary, you look at Poland, you look at Austria even, and of course, Germany. I mean, the Nazi regime was the ultimate expression of that. Um, that meaning that a country does not belong to its citizens, which is a Western European concept. Western European nationalism, including what you have in the States, although Trump is trying to change that, I think, with his white Christian supremacy. But what you have in the States and in Western Europe is a civil nationalism. It's a nationalism of the state. So, you're French, you're British, you're Belgium or whatever. And the idea is that, you're a citizen of the state. So the state belongs to its citizens. It doesn't belong to any particular ethnic group or racial group or whatever. In Eastern Europe, it's completely different. In Eastern Europe, a country belongs to one particular group. That's where we get this concept of nation state. The concept is that, Hungary belongs to the Hungarians. And therefore, everybody who's not Hungarian, should be purified or ethnically cleansed or driven out or whatever. And of course, there were two main minorities in Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe was pretty much divided up among these ethnic groups. The Jews and the Roma were the major exceptions. They were like nations within nations. And even that was intolerable. Uh, and so that's why Jews and the Roma, including in the Nazi times, of course, the Roma, were especially targeted. Uh, but at the same time, that was the context within which Zionism developed. Whether it's Theodor Herzl, who comes from Vienna, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, who was very much involved with this ethno-nationalism, or Ben Gurion and the mainstream Zionists who came from Russia or Poland, in Eastern Europe, they all came out of this ethno-national idea that a country belongs to a particular people. And then, if you go with that logic, then the Jews are a people. Now, the revolution of Zionism, of course, was to define the Jews as a national group, not as simply an ethnic group or a religious group or a cultural group, so that the Zionists, defined the Jews as a national group. Therefore, it kind of had rights to national determination, self-determination. They looked around and say, well, wait a minute, if we're a national group, what are we a nation of? Where do we come from? Well, the land of Israel. And so the idea then became the land of Israel, which is Palestine. I mean, they didn't call it Palestine. And the Arabs, and this is important, had nothing to do with this story whatsoever. They're not until today. They're not really a part of the story. It's an us story. We're the Jews. Our homeland is the land of Israel. They made up a story about being exiled by the Romans, which is not true. So we're not really coming back because we were never expelled from this country. Jews left the country for all kinds of reasons, mainly economic and trade reasons, but they were not expelled. The Romans did not expel populations. They took captives, they took slaves, and so on. And remember, in Palestine at that time, 100 or 150 years after the destruction of Jerusalem and everything else, when the Jews, according to Zionism, were supposed to have been exiled, you had a flourishing of Jewish culture in Palestine. You had all these academic yeshivas. The Jerusalem Talmud developed pretty soon in history after this so-called expulsion. You had the Yavne yeshivas, you had Sipora, you had all famous yeshivas and the whole Jew. So there was a flourishing of Jewish life afterwards. But it doesn't matter because every settler colonial movement makes up a story, a narrative about why the country belongs to them. Because if you don't have the story, you're just a thief. You're invading someone else's country, which in fact settlers do. Uh, so that, for example, the Americans, you guys, had your manifest destiny. God intended North America to be, a white Christian kind of a country. Um, the South Africans, the Boers had that same sort of a thing. The Bible gave Africa to the white man. The French had their idea of civilizing the natives. Everybody has their story. Um, our story was easy because we have the Bible. So here it's written down. God gave us this country. So even if you're not religious, like the vast majority of Zionists were not, it fit in very well, and it's reflected in the Declaration of Independence as well. So you have the story, and why the land of Israel belongs to us, and the Arabs. This became what was known in Zionism as the hidden question. you know, uh, Once in a while in a Zionist Congress or somewhere, someone would peep up and say, what about the Arabs? I mean, what about the people that are kind of living there? I mean, they were at that time about 90 some percent of the population. I mean, they were pretty visible. And the story was, well, we don't deal with that. That's not they're intruders, which is what you hear until today. Um, there is no Palestinian people, of course. Um, Whatever. They were simply ignored. They weren't a part of the equation. They became what was called the hidden question. So it was our story. And so the idea then is that the land of Israel was barren because they don't count for anything. So you had that famous saying by Israel Zangwill that Palestine was a country without a people, right? For a people without a country. It was barren, and then you get that whole kind of a thing too. The Arabs ruined the country, and we're going to revive it. I mean, you hear this until today in Zionist propaganda. We made the desert bloom and all that kind of stuff. So that set the stage then. That we're coming back to our country, and our country is the land of Israel, and it belongs exclusively to us. See, this is the key piece coming out of Eastern Europe. It isn't that we're coming back and we're going to take over the country, or we're going to be the majority, or, and somewhere there's a place for Arabs, for Palestinians, whether they're minority, whether they're, you know, there's a recognition that they're there. In normal colonialism, classical colonialism, a country was conquered, but you acknowledge that there was a native population. In settler colonialism, you can't acknowledge them, especially in Zionist settler colonialism, because that undermines your claim to that this country is yours. The minute you say there's a Palestinian people here, or there's another people here, all right, now you got to deal with them. Now, how do you exert your claim to exclusivity? So this comes from Eastern Europe, the idea of the nation state here, that this is a country that not only belongs to the Jewish people, but belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. And then, of course, it's a violent enterprise, settler colonialism, because you are invading somebody else's country. There is another people living there that consider themselves the indigenous or local population that own the land. They have their culture, they have their heritage, they have their life there. There was a Palestine. It wasn't, a desert or something. Um, Language and everything else. So you have to, so if the settlers come in with the intention of taking it over, and violently, if there's resistance, it's violence. The first Zionist Congress was 1897. What was called the Second Aliyah, which was called the founding Zionist Aliyah, was 1904. And the first Jewish militia that emerges here, the Zionist militia, is 1909. So right away, you have to have a militia because as you're purchasing the land or taking over the land, you've got to displace the local population. Obviously, you can't transform Palestine into Israel, an Arab country into a Jewish country, without displacing the population and taking their land and eventually erasing them as a population, right? So I know people is going to agree to be displaced and erased. So there's resistance, right? And so you have to have a militarized. It's a militarized enterprise. It has to be violent, but at the same time, because you don't recognize the existence and certainly the rights of the indigenous population until today, Israel does not recognize that there is a Palestinian people or that it has national rights until this moment. In Oslo, in the golden days of Oslo, with Clinton and Arafat and Rabin on the White House lawn, all Israel did was recognize the PLO as a negotiating partner. It did not recognize Palestinian national rights, right? The two-state solution was not a part of the Oslo equation. It was never mentioned in Oslo. So, all right, so now if basically the indigenous population don't exist, the land is empty, and the natives that are running around are a collection of natives. They don't add up, they don't amount to a people or a nation with national rights like ours. So our rights are exclusive, they have none. Well, then you can't have resistance because to recognize resistance, you have to recognize that there's a people that is trying to protect something or trying to assert their rights or trying to push back against the invading settlers. But you can't admit that because you can't, by admitting there's resistance, by implication, you're admitting there's a people that have grievances and maybe rights, and maybe there is something to their resistance. Why are they resisting? You see? And so you criminalize. Every settler colonial enterprise criminalizes resistance. You don't call it resistance, you call it terrorism. Before 1948, they used to call the Arabs gangs, Arab gangs, all these kinds of criminal terms you hear until today with Hamas and the Palestine. So we don't even use the word resistance. So the language is really important as well in all of this. So then, without going into all the history, Zionism succeeded in that in 1947, when the British left, the UN, that was basically a European club at that time, decided to partition the country. So the third of the population that was Jewish, the vast majority of whom were newcomers to the country, got 56% of the country. In the partition plan, the indigenous population, the Palestinians, who were at that time about two-thirds of the population, got 42% of the country. The other couple percent was Jerusalem and Bethlehem that were internationalized. So, of course, the Zionists accepted that. It was a good deal. But Ben Gurion always said, this isn't the end. We're going to grow this, right? So they accepted. The Palestinians didn't accept. Now, everybody blames them for that today. See, if you had wanted peace like we Jews want peace, you would have had, 42% of the country. You wouldn't be fighting, trying to get 22% that's left, in the occupation of today. But no colonized population would ever agree that two-thirds of their country goes to invaders, to foreigners, to people that really have no claim, no legitimate claim to the country and want to displace them. And so you had the war in 48. We call it the War of Independence. The Palestinians call it the Nakba, the catastrophe, in which, you know, as settler colonialism does, 85% of the Arabs that lived within what became Israel were expelled by force from the country, forcibly displaced. Today, half the Palestinian people, until today, are refugees outside the country mainly, and then of course Israel. Now there's an Israel after the war in 48. After actually May 48, uh, took 90% of their land. So they lost all their land. 750,000 Palestinians were violently expelled from the country, and it became Israel. Not the 56%, now it's 78%. The map of Israel that we know today, basically. And then, of course, in 1967, Israel took the rest of the country, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. And now that's and then people talked about a two-state idea. That was the idea. Israel never ever accepted the two-state idea. And here's where we begin to get into apartheid. Um, because we want the whole country. The idea of Zionism isn't to take 78%, it's to take all of Palestine or all of the land of Israel. And don't forget, if you look at the map for most people, two states kind of makes some sense. Here on the left of the map is Israel, here on the right of the map is the West Bank. All right, and you could somehow connect that to Gaza and with some little corridor. And okay, all right, that's a two-state solution. It makes sense on the map. But we have to remember that what we call the West Bank, which seems detachable and kind of on the side, is for Jews and for nationalist Jews, not only religious Jews, Judea and Samaria. This is the heart of the land of Israel. If you got to give up something, give up Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was Philistine territory in the biblical days. It wasn't even the land of Israel. And so the idea that we're going to give Judea and Samaria with the cauldron of Jewish history in the biblical times to Arabs is ridiculous. So the two-state solution was never ever in the cards, and it was all looking at the entire country. And here's then where we come to the crunch, because today, as we can see, Israel controls all of historic Palestine, and is now. Okay, now how does settler colonialism end? It ends by normalization. It's like T.S. Eliot, it ends with a whimper, not with a bang. Doesn't end with a big decisive battle or a defeat or a victory. It ends by simply being normalized. You create facts on the ground, which is what Israel calls its settlement project. There are now almost 800 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. You displace the local population here with the help of Trump. Netanyahu would like to send 2.5 million Palestinians from Gaza to Libya, right, and create a little Riviera. And the settlers are already have all the master plans for settling Gaza. Uh, and of course, the settlers are violently taking over vast tracts of territory in the West Bank today. So there is no on the ground possibility of a two-state solution, even if that was ever entertained. So Israel basically has already taken the entire country, and normalization, the Abraham Accords of Trump, if Saudi Arabia falls in, which it will, is the end of it. That's it. Israel and all its settlements are are now Israel. That's this the whole settler colonial project after 130 years has been normalized and it's over. And there's nowhere for Palestinians to go. They're not even a part of the equation because they're non-state actors. You see? So this is all a deal, of course, a Trumpian transactional deal between Israel, the Arab states, and the United States. The Palestinians are not even consulted. Now, where does the apartheid come in? It comes in because Israel can't kill, or even though there is genocide going on, it can't kill or displace all the Palestinians. In fact, half the population of this country today, between the river and the sea, is Palestinian. You know, there's about 7 million Palestinians, about 7 million Israeli Jews. Although within the Israeli Jews, you've got a bunch of Russians who aren't really Jewish, but leave that aside. So it's roughly half and half. So now the question is, okay, if we want a Jewish state and the entire country belongs to us, what do we do with these 7 million Arabs? You know, we don't use the word Palestinians in Israel. We call them Arabs because to call them Palestinians would be to admit that there's another people here that we deny. So what do we do with these Arabs? The only answer, and this was like in South Africa, the only answer is apartheid. You've got to, you have to, you know, I mean, they're here. You can't, you're stuck with them. So you can't give them citizenship because then it wouldn't be a Jewish state. And you've taken almost all the land. So what you do is you shove them into little enclaves. And we're talking about, I can show you on a map here, but we can do that afterwards if you want to. We're talking about 4 enclaves, what are around what's called areas A and B of the West Bank and Gaza. So you have a little enclave in the north around Nablus, Tulkarm, Qalqilia, Jenin, and then a big settlement block of Ariel that divides the West Bank in half, and then another enclave around Ramallah, Salfit in the middle, going maybe to Jericho, and then the huge Greater Jerusalem area in the West Bank going into Ma'ale Adumim and all the way to the Dead Sea, and then another Palestinian enclave to the south around Hebron, Halhul, Bethlehem, in that area. So 3 enclaves and Gaza, what's ever left of Gaza. So basically, then Israel is normalized on 85% of historic Palestine, and the Palestinians, who are half again the population, and the indigenous population have lost all their lands and are marginalized, are stuck in 4 little enclaves on 15% of Palestine, and that's a Bantustan, to use the South African term, a Bantustan or a homeland, they called them as well, like Transkei. And that's, you know, so in other words, settler colonialism has to end up either in genocide. Genocide is built into settler colonialism. Um, but if you can't eliminate the native population, you can then marginalize them in these little areas without rights. Now, it has to be presentable cosmetically. So we'll call this Bantustan a state. That's what South Africa did. Remember, they were 10 Bantustans on 11% of South African land. Transkei and all these things. The difference being that the international community never recognized the South African Bantustans. The international community saw them for what they were, simply uh, prisons in a way. Uh, uh, you know, and if they could be recognized as states, then they're off the hands of the white South Africans. And the difference being that here, the international community led by the United States will recognize the Bantustan of Palestine. They'll have a president, you know, maybe it'll even be in the UN, but it's going to be non-sovereign because it's a landlocked enclave. There is no border with an Arab state. There's no viable economy. There's no freedom of movement of people or goods. There's no control of vital resources, including water and airspace. Uh, the Israeli army insists on even having a presence within the Palestinian state. So it's, and of course, the refugees can't return. That's super important for Palestinians. Half their population who are refugees cannot return because you can't return to these little tiny islands. But we'll call it a state. And what Israel, and I think the United States relies on, is that who's going to read the fine print? 2 states, okay, great. Nobody's going to, who in the hell is going to ask, is it viable? I mean, who cares enough and knows enough to look at the map and say, wait a minute, is this really sovereign? Is this nobody's? So they'll accept it at face value, two states, and we're home free. The final word being then that all of this, I mean, everything is in violation of international law. Every international law, from not only international law but covenants and so on, the Charter of the UN that guarantees Palestinians' rights of self-determination. Um, there are laws against the crime of apartheid. I mean, apartheid itself is a criminal is a criminal enterprise. Um, the Fourth Geneva Convention, that protects populations in occupied territories. So, for example, Israel is not allowed to build settlements according to the Fourth Geneva Convention. You can't do anything according to the Fourth Geneva Convention and other international laws that change the status of the occupied territory because this is considered occupation. Now, we've gone beyond that today. The United States has said under Trump, no, it's not occupation anymore. The settlements are okay. And so we've got that problem. But the international community considered it occupation. The International Court of Justice ruled that it is occupation. And therefore, the Fourth Geneva Convention applies, which means you can't build settlements, can't build highways, you can't move your civilian population in, you can't harm the local population, you can't demolish their homes. You can't harm them economically. You can't prevent their freedom of movement. I mean, go on and on and on and on. So Israel's in violation of every article of the 14th Convention, and of course is now committing genocide, or plausible genocide, as the ICJ called it. The problem being then, and I'll end on this, the problem being with international law is beautiful. I mean, there's international laws and the language is nice, and they've really been thought out. Do you know there's an international law that you have the right to live in an aesthetic, healthy environment? I mean, really, things have been thought through to the nth degree of what is good for human beings and what should be enforced. But there's no enforcement. That's the fatal flaw of international law. There's no enforcement because all international law, all sanctions have to be done through the UN, through the Security Council, and the United States has the veto. And so this is all in violation of international law, but there's no enforcement. So we have an apartheid state that is becoming permanentized through the normalization process, and the Palestinians are completely lost in the process. Whatever rights they have mean nothing, and they're a completely vulnerable, unprotected population. And I'll leave you on that high note.
Thank you, Jeff. I see some questions here. I wanted to ask, first of all, thank you for your presentation. And you ended with international law, and I think right now we have a crisis of international law where, I think the Global South has known for a long time that there's a lot of hypocrisy in international law, but I think now Westerners are also beginning to wake up to this crisis. So I was wondering your thoughts on what is the future of international law at this point in time. So if you could maybe say some things about this.
I mean, I'll be very honest. I think it means nothing. Human rights, international law, unless they're enforceable, I mean, they're nice platitudes. They don't mean anything, and that's why I'm really critical of the BDS movement. And what's happened to the Palestinians is because they're so much in despair, because they have really no political clout and no they've retreated into what they call the human rights approach. So they're beginning to say, you have this a lot, especially among young Palestinians, actually. We don't care what a political solution is. I don't care if it's 2 states or 10 states, just give me my human rights. And the assumption is if I get my human rights and international law is somehow put in place, the whole occupation will crumble from its own illegality. We'll get our rights, and then we can figure out, how we're going to live politically, something like that. I mean, that's really a position of weakness, of despair, actually, because there is no human rights approach. Who is going to enact international law? Who is going to enforce it? Who's going to, you know, and I just go back to Stalin's famous, and you know this, but when maybe young people don't know it so much. Stalin wanted to do something. I can't remember what. And one of his advisors said the Pope's not going to like it. And Stalin said, "Yeah, how many divisions does the Pope have?" So, how many divisions does Guterres have in the US, in the UN? How many divisions can the Palestinians mobilize in order to get their human rights enforced or international law? That doesn't exist. So I think we have to be political. We have to use human rights to legitimize what we're doing, to guide what we're doing, certainly. But you cannot rely on human rights as an effective vehicle for liberation.
I think this is a good pivot for another question that someone asked, which is for you to speak more about the one state solution. You spoke a little bit about the situation on the ground, which is in effect a one state. So maybe talk a little bit more about political visions, I think is a good pivot here.
Well, I guess it begins with a vision because, I'm just as powerless as everybody else. Uh, but at the same time, we're arguing in the one, I'm a part of a group called the One Democratic State Campaign, which is Palestinian led, but there are quite a few Israeli Jews involved as well. And the idea being that you can't be in a political struggle without a political program. And the two-state solution cannot be the default program because it's apartheid. We want people to start talking about two-state apartheid and not the two-state solution. There isn't anything like that. So we're really faced with a very stark, binary choice. Either we have apartheid, which is the only logical political conclusion to Israel being a Jewish country that belongs to Jews, that control all the land, that control the country militarily, and so on, and having half the population not being Jewish, and therefore being excluded. The only way you can deal with that is apartheid. Or the other binary choice is one state. Go with the flow. There already is one state? Some people say, no, the one state is so far-fetched, and the two states been accepted by the UN, and we can work on. No, the two-state solution, if it really somehow was enforced, even that's not just because the Palestinians only get 22% of the country, but let's say it would mean moving 800,000 Israelis out of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem becoming Palestinian. Can anybody in their right mind imagine anything like that happening? I mean, it just logistically, it's just impossible. It's ridiculous. So it's easier to go with the flow, and the flow is that Israel has already, there is one state today. This is, by the way, the definition of apartheid. The definition of apartheid is when there is one governmental system, one legal system, right? Um, that rules the country, but there's a separate legal system for another racial or ethnic group. You see? So you have here Israel is a sovereign today over all of from the river to the sea. It's a sovereign. I mean, the Palestinian authorities is not sovereign in any way. So there's one sovereign state. There's one legal system. All those 800,000 settlers all live under Israeli law, right? But there's a separate legal system for Palestinians. In fact, there's two. One is the military law for Palestinians living in Area C, which is under Israeli control. And all Palestinians there are tried in military courts. And then there's a Palestinian legal system that is kind of that's used in areas A and B. But the point is, they're all living, the Palestinians, within a state that has effective control, including legal control over the entire territory, but are living in a separate legal system. That's the definition of apartheid. So that's the only. So what we're saying with the one state is, it's very simple and straightforward. Let's have a constitution that grant, in other words, it's a move. The revolution here is a move from the ethno-nationalism of Eastern Europe and Zionism that said this country belongs to the Jews exclusively, to the kind of system that you guys know, a country that belongs to its citizens. So the big revolution here is the idea of a citizen. In Israel, you don't have the idea of a citizen really, because you also have separate laws for Palestinian citizens of Israel, for example. Um, um, I won't get into all of that. So the idea is, all right, a constitutional democracy, equal rights, one parliament, one set of elections, one legal system, one citizenship, like what you have until today. I don't know tomorrow, but you have that until today in the United States. So it's not very complicated. Individual liberties for everyone. And then, of course, the big complication is the nationalism part, because you still have two national groups in the country. This isn't Kansas, where we're just a bunch of individual citizens. So, and nationalism is very dangerous, because nationalism has the urge to rule, for hegemony, and we're liable to get into a situation of a civil war between Israelis and Palestinians over who's going to rule the country. That's been the experience of a lot of post-colonial countries. So what we have to do is create a civil state, a new state, maybe with a new name. It could be called Palestine Israel, could be called Zatar, I don't know, whatever we call it. A civil state that everybody is a citizen of, and then within that civil state, you allow space for the different national groups. Palestinian national groups, they can have, nobody's going to close Birzeit University. For the Israeli national group, nobody's going to close the Hebrew University. You'll have Hebrew and Arabic. You can have your holidays, your museums, your national life, but within the framework of the civil state. That's the ideal. Now, the path to that, I mean, who knows? But this, I guess, the strength of it is that it is a binary choice. I mean, in the end, the world is either going to accept Israel as an apartheid state, ruling over 7 million Palestinians that have no rights, or are locked into a Bantustan, which I don't think is good for Jews in general, or there's going to be simply the force of the reality, the political reality is going to be one in which there is one state. So we have to see how it all works out.
Thank you, Jeff. I see Fahed has his hand up, but I do have a few questions in chat, so let me just address them before Fahed asks his question. So the
Okay.
first one I think is um about Israelis who are working like you, who are actually working towards collective liberation, who are working alongside Palestinians. How are they being perceived in Israel right now, especially considering the context of, a war and genocide? Now there's kind of a lot of public opinion that is, much more far right maybe than the last 10 years. So I think some people have questions on that. And then maybe expanding more, I think you mentioned the Russians. Obviously, there's also Palestinian citizens of Israel in Israel's demographic, and then also Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews. I mean, there's so much of this demographic. So I wonder if you could also, expand on how this demographic like plays into Israel's politics as well.
Well, I mean, basically, we're invisible. We're not Zionists. Some of us are anti-Zionists, some of are post-Zionists, or whatever term you want to use. But of course, the idea of one state is a non-starter in Israel. In Israel, yeah, so people say, well, why don't you start a political party? Or, if this is a Palestinian-led group, why don't you get together Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israeli Jewish citizens of Israel and start a party? You can't, because in order to run for parliament in Israel, you have to sign a declaration that you recognize Israel as a Jewish state. So the very rules of the so-called democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, are such that a program like ours simply cannot be, because one state wouldn't be a Jewish state, of course. So there's no traction. And I think it's like South Africa again. Uh, People say, well, the Israelis would never agree to it. Of course, they're not going to agree. Why would you, as colonists that control all the resources, all the riches of the country, have political power, military, why would you give that up? For a population that really, an Arab population, justice aside, is weak, has no clout. There's no reason. What's your motivation for doing that? I mean, it's just a non-starter for Israelis. I mean, it's stupid. So I think it's like South Africa, where South Africa, the whites were not going to dismantle apartheid. Why would they? So the ANC ignored them. It said, we're not going to make our independence, our liberation, dependent on whether white South Africans agree or not. Palestinians can't make their liberation dependent on whether Israeli Jews agree or not. You have to bypass them. So what did the ANC did? They bypassed the whites and they went to all of us at a certain age. You're too young, but but some of the people here, I mean, Fad remembers this. You know, we were all part of an anti-apartheid movement, and it was like a pincher movement. And together, collectively, we made this, the apartheid regime of South Africa unsustainable. And it collapsed, and then you had the transition to democracy. And you know what? The South Africans, their word was a bloodbath. They said if the white apartheid regime collapses, there'll be a bloodbath here. Never happened. It was a peaceful transition. I mean, there were economic problems. I can't say it was perfect by any, but politically, it was a peaceful transition to democracy. And I think we have to replicate that here. I think we have to forget the Israelis. They are not going to be in any way partners in this. And we have to go to the international community, which means not governments, but you guys, because you can influence your governments and create a condition in which Israeli apartheid becomes unsustainable. That's where BDS plays an important role. You know, Israel already, even by its own actions in Gaza, is becoming a pariah state. To some, Israel's more vulnerable. I always say to the Palestinians, listen, Fayed, the Israel's not as strong as you think it is. Because for Palestinians, certainly living in the occupied territories, Israel is this super, you know, all they see is soldiers and tanks, and, you know, they can't imagine, you know, defeating Israel. But it's much more vulnerable internationally, I think, than people realize. And the Palestinians are much stronger than they realize. They see themselves as kind of this weak partner in a way. They don't really know, and this is something that should be conveyed to the peoples of Palestine more, the tremendous international support they have all over the world from the peoples, if not from the governments. You know, we have to make a differentiation here. And so I think if, but that's where the political program comes in, because there is no, except for our group, and our group is very weak right now, there is no Palestinian political presence or political program at all. They're completely, they're not even at the table. The parties are dysfunctional. Every political party is dysfunctional. And every political party in Palestine, from Fatah to the DFLP on the left to Hamas, are all two-state parties. So they're irrelevant. The PA is collaborationist. The PLO has been dismantled. And there is no political group, that a Palestinian group, that has a political program that it can advance. So even though you're all mobilized for Palestine all over the world, a tremendous, strong resource, you can only go so far. You can't go to Congress and advocate for a solution, a program, because the Palestinians haven't articulated one yet. You can't represent Palestinians. We have to wait on them. And that's really the problem today. I think there's no ANC anymore. The PLO was dismantled, and that's where the Palestinians are. But I think if they can overcome that, if they can begin to organize politically around a political program that has to be one state, I think they have much more potential clout than they realize. But this has to be mobilized, and that's why the human rights and international law can help. Certainly, they can give a certain legitimacy to that, but it's got to be political. There's got to be a political program, and not sitting back and saying, "Well, if you give me my human rights, things will be fine." That's not a political position.
Fahad, feel free to
Jeff,
ask.
my question, first of all, uh, a million thanks for your presentation. Every time I hear you, you bring hope when you don't find hope. Number one. Two, if your next trip to the USA, we would like to host you in Atlanta, Georgia. My real question is this. the professor of economics, Richard, in the University of Chicago,
Mhm.
said if Israel came 200 years ago, it would have worked. But now, exactly as you said, we're only 155,000 that remain as in Israel, and now we are 2 million.
Right.
In Gaza, 2.3,
Right.
and in the West Bank, 2.8. Exactly what you said, 7.7. My real question to you right now, it seemed like some of the American Jewish people start to wake up because of Gaza.
Right.
The question will
Mhm.
happen the same with the Israeli Jewish people, because unless the American and the Israeli Jewish people start talking like you, the Palestinians are going to continue suffering.
But they can't talk like me because I can't talk like me. I mean, I can't go out. I do speaking tours, and I raise the issue of the one state. I have to stop short of advocating for it because it's the Palestinians' call. It's their prerogative. I can't, certainly as an Israeli Jew, but anybody who's not Palestinian can say I support this. They can bring it up. They can, but there has the Palestinians have to be the ones that say this is our political program. This is where we're going, and this is what we want you to advocate for. And the Palestinian voice is missing. Uh, uh, and I'm not saying this critically. I'm saying this, Palestinians, as you know, have a tremendously hard road to row. Uh, you know, I can't begin to convey. You're asking about the differences inside Israel as well. I can't begin to convey the degree of suppression that Palestinians live under, even in citizens of Israel. It used to be the Palestinian citizens of Israel had more latitude. They could speak out, they could demonstrate, they could write. That's kind of gone. They're this much better off than the Palestinians of the West Bank. The repression, the arrests. I mean, there are tens of thousands, or at least 10,000, Palestinians who are either in administrative detention, sitting in jail with no trial or anything else, including kids, a lot of kids, or, are actually in prison. Israel, if you're an emerging leader, really, beginning to be effective, Israel's going to kill you or imprison you. So, people ask, well, where's the Palestinian Mandela? The Palestinian Mandela is either dead or in prison, you know, and that's, from the age of 12 up. So the leadership is decapitated. Uh, the group I work with today, I mean, our problem is that I think the Palestinians in our group are afraid to step out as a movement. We have a program. We have a website. It's onestatecampaign.org. We've got a 10-point program. We've thought it through. But they're not willing to step out politically because they're really afraid. And they're not only afraid of Israel, but the PA is just as vicious as Israel, especially within the Palestinian community. I can't tell you how many thousands of collaborators there are. So, the idea that there should be a Palestinian leadership that takes this program and then mobilizes all of us is nice to say, but in reality, you've got to be tremendously brave. I mean, you're risking your not only your own life, your family's life, and so on, by even advocating for one democratic state. So, but at the same time, there's no alternative. This is a Palestinian-led struggle, and we have to wait on the Palestinians, and that whole dynamic, I think, is what really is. I think Palestinians in a diaspora could play a much more important role. Let me just say one thing, and this is going to be critical. Well, maybe I'm not going to say it actually. But the point all right, let me just say this, that I think academics could play much more of a role. There are hundreds of Palestinian academics in the United States in universities. Well, they write articles that are good articles. They have conferences. They're on Shabaka. They do all kinds of things, but they're not political. There is, in other words, people in the Palestinians in the diaspora that have the analysis that can help put political programs together, um, and that have that freedom. Well, and of course we know, that they're also threatened. I mean, it's less than here, but in other words, maybe the diaspora could take more of a role. Maybe the diaspora in Europe, I don't know. But the problem is we're stuck unless we can get a critical mass of Palestinians to come out and advocate for a political program that would then be able to mobilize you politically. And that's the flaw in everything.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I think this emphasizes a lot of the role that Palestinian diaspora can play, and then also the international community as well, putting pressure alongside that. I think Nabil has a question. I saw it in the chat, but you can speak. You could, yeah.
This for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Nabil.
I don't know if you remember me, but we had a fundraiser in 2003 for Salim and Arabiya Shawamra, if you remember. You stayed at my house and we had a fundraiser. It was I hope we can do this again. And you're welcome here anytime you want in Detroit.
Okay.
So anyway, thank you for, and it's great to see you again. I have a question and a comment and a question. I was going to start with the question, but I'll do a very quick comment. This thing about where's your Mandela? And you basically answered it correctly, right? That either been killed or in prison. But I've even gone beyond that. So I always ask the question to the one that asked me the question, where's your Mandela? Where is your de Klerk, right? Where's your de Klerk? Or, because you're always asking us the question beyond the fact that they're either killed or in jail. Where's yours? Show me one on your side and I'll show you 100 on my side. So, I mean, it was just mainly a comment here, but if you ever come to the state, I heard Fahad, Abu Akil Fahad is a friend of mine. If you ever come to the state, would love to take you on a tour, all over the place in here. We'll be more than happy to take you. So please let us know. But here's the only question that I have for you. Is you mentioned at the beginning about the diaspora of the Jews under Rome, under the Roman rule, and you said that they were not forced out. Now, I'm not naive. I've been reading and listening and talking for the last 35 years, but the general discourse, and it's not necessarily bad in a way, but it's maybe misinformation that they were expelled by the Romans, right? And of course, the ones that stayed behind, what we say, the ones that stayed behind, who knows what happened to them, converted, changed, who knows, right? But my only question to you is,
but okay.
I'm sorry?
It's not true, but what's the question?
No, and I believe you. I have no doubt. What I'm saying to you is, where can I find something either written by you or by someone else, something credible to talk about the story of what happened, right?
This isn't a wallpaper. These are real books. So, for example, there's a lot of histories of the Jewish people. Shlomo Sand writes about this. He has a book, The Invention of the Jewish People, so on. And I wasn't sure about it either, to tell you the truth. I mean, I never really had thought about it so much. But so I went and I started to look in books. Some of the famous Israeli historians, Ettinger and others. And it's true. If you go through, this is a history by Ben Sasson, who's a famous Israeli historian. If you start to go look in the Roman era, there is no expulsion. It's not a part of the story. It's never mentioned any kind of expulsion. They were captives taken. You have Titan's Arch and all that stuff, but Romans did not expel populations. So in other words, it's simply a part of a narrative, the made-up narrative that we were expelled and now we're coming back. Now there were a lot of Jews that they were. I've never been able to find really population numbers, but at this time there was a huge Jewish population abroad because Jews were traders and they were very much in commerce. So you had all over the Mediterranean, and then moving into Europe, you had a lot of Jews that were out there. So I think more than expelled, I think most of the Jews probably that you find abroad today are descendants of Jews that probably left Palestine, who knows when, in order to do trading. They aren't the descendants, in my view, of people that were expelled. But you can, look up history books and try to find it. If you can find a story of expulsion, let me know. I haven't found one yet.
Yeah. No, like I said, I had zero doubt of what you're saying. I'm just saying, find something that is, like written by someone that is, credible. Like, you know what I mean? But like you're saying you were skeptical. You did not know you were skeptical. That's what I'm saying, because this is the first time that I hear from you, like with assertion that they were not expelled. And it's not that I had any doubt, but I don't have
Right.
anything like really because I've
But
got.
let me just say one more thing. Let me just say, even if they were expelled, it doesn't make a difference. In other words,
I know, I agree.
Jews have a right. Jews have a right to live in this country. I mean, people have a right. Part of international law is freedom of movement, freedom of living wherever you want to live. Jews and Jews have always lived here in this country.
Correct.
Had the Zionist movement said, um, we want to, and there was a group like this, Brit Shalom, of some very prominent Zionists. There was a movement of what were called cultural Zionists who said,
Correct.
yes, we want to revive our national culture. We want a Hebrew university. We want a Hebrew language, a Hebrew literature. We want to come back to our homeland. But we recognize and acknowledge that there is another people living here, Palestine, and they're also in a process of after World War I of nation building and getting their own identity together. Let's do that. In other words, we can develop a Jewish national culture here in our homeland without a state. Doesn't have to be a Jewish state. We can do it together. They were Eliezer ben Yehuda was a part of that. Henrietta Zold, who started Hadassah. Judah Magnus, the first president of Hebrew University. I mean, all kinds of people were a part of this. But they were intellectuals more. And so it was the Ben Gurions, the militaristic Zionists that won out in the end, as usual. So I could very much make a case, if I had to, for the one democratic state idea in Zionist terms. I could go before a synagogue and sell it in Zionist terms, in terms of a cultural Zionism. And like I said in my presentation, there is a space for Jewish national identity. Nobody is saying you can't be Israeli. You can't be, Jewish or religious or national or whatever, but within the framework of a civil state in which you're living together with others. In other words, the sin of Zionism was not coming back to this country. The sin of Zionism was to come back as invaders, as a movement, a settler colonial movement. That's what they chose. And you have no right to do that. You have a right to come back. You have no right to come to somebody else's country and say, we're going to displace you. We're going to Judaize the country. This is a key word. This is the word that captures, we don't use it often, but it captures the essence of Zionism, Judaization. The whole purpose was to Judaize Palestine. That's illegal, that's immoral, that's unjust, and whether or not Jews were expelled by the Romans doesn't change that, I think.
Just one more comment and let other people talk, of course. So I agree with you, and I've been following Peter Beinart for several years, and Peter Beinart calls himself a cultural Jew.
Right.
I had him here speaking 6 engagements and about 2 months ago. That's why I'd love to have you here. Excuse me. And also, I don't know if you know Benji Ben Baruch. He writes a lot, and he's one of the people, Peter's followers, but he also writes extensively about cultural Zionism. So I agree with you. And anytime you want to come back here, Jeff, you have my number. I have yours. You're welcome to come back, and would love to host you.
Be careful. I might pick up on that invitation.
Absolutely. And the kitchen is open here 24/7, by the way.
All right. I'm on my way.
Okay, we're approaching the end of the session, so I'll only take one more question. I see Linda has her hand up, so let's just have that and then we can conclude the session. Linda?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for this very feisty debate, and it's really interesting with new angles. I just want to go back to this idea that the Palestinians need to be the ones kind of leading the narrative in terms of the fact they haven't got a leader at the moment, etc. And I just find that really difficult. I don't know if it's because things have got so much worse in the last 2 years and some Israelis are out of date with exactly how, I just don't know how it's possible, and it feels feels a little bit victim blaming. Just being controversial myself, but it does feel like those who have unlimited power, supported by the biggest military and the biggest power in the world, who I think is the one controlling why the rest of our governments don't stand up. How on earth can Israel or those who support Palestine, sort of say Palestinians have got to rise up? It's absolute suicide. Netanyahu would love to have an excuse to absolutely obliterate the West Bank, like they've used the excuse of for Gaza.
No, you're right. I mean, we're very active in terms of resisting with the Palestinians, but ourselves as well. We resist house demolitions, for example. We're out in the West Bank all the time fighting the army. I'm doing speaking tours, talking against Israeli policy, what Israel's doing in Gaza and so on, trying to mobilize all of you abroad, working with groups abroad. We're doing all of that. I agree. We have to use our privilege and our power and our accessibility to go out and really protect. I know that sounds patronizing, but to protect the Palestinians, to articulate the crimes that Israel is doing and the crimes that Israel's allowed to do because of our governments and so on. All that is true. But when it comes to people saying, okay, what's the solution? Where is this going to go? That's where I have to step back and allow the Palestinians to come in. I believe I have a voice because it's an anti-colonial movement. And so I see myself as a partner with Palestinians in that. But the basic idea is this going to be, I'll give you just one example. For most Palestinians, liberation, I'm talking about our concept is a civil state within which you have two national groups, but it's a civil state that belongs to its citizens. That's not acceptable to the vast majority of Palestinians. For Palestinians overall, their idea of liberation is liberation. This country is Palestine. It should be called Palestine. It shouldn't be called Palestine, Israel, or anything else. It should become a Palestinian. Palestinians should have their national rights restored, including their right of self-determination. Now, within that state, Jews will have equal rights, but only as Jews, not as Israelis. They refuse to recognize Israel or Israelis as a national group because they feel that that's rewarding settler colonialism. I mean, you made up this idea that you're a national group and now you expect us Palestinians to accept it? No. So now that's a non-starter for Israelis. And I think it's a problem for me too, because I think it plants the seeds of civil conflict. You can't suppress anybody's identity. But all I'm trying to say here is there's some really fundamental issues that have to be resolved. And that has to be resolved, first of all, among Palestinians, and maybe Palestinians in conversation with Israelis like me, so that we come up with a political program like the 10-point program we came up with in the One Democratic State campaign, that then we can go forward and say to all of you, join in. But that part of the liberation process, where are we going? What's our political program? In my view, at least, has to be articulated by Palestinians themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, so much for articulating your vision and giving this presentation today. Is there any last comments you want to say to the international community before we conclude?
Well, the only thing, that we have to watch out for, and I'm trying to start a campaign like this, but nobody is interested, is this issue of normalization. And this is where Trump is going. Don't forget, Iran has been a distraction. Gaza, where we're really going, the end game for Netanyahu is to normalize all of this. Because once Israel and its settlements are normalized, and there's normal diplomatic relations with the Arab world, with the United States, and then Europe will fall in and so on, it's over. There's no political space after normalization. Palestinians are going to be locked into this Bantustan because it'll be a two-state apartheid solution, normalization. Palestinians say, hey, okay, now what about our rights? And you know what the answer is going to be? Hey, we normalized. It's over. We're moving on to Sudan. We're moving on to what's left of Ukraine, other issues. So this is, I think, the greatest threat. I think the Abraham Accords, are the greatest threat to the Palestinians since the Nakba in 1948. The trouble is, people are not thinking politically. Normalization is such a dry, gray academic term that you can't try to go out and mobilize young people around normalization. But this is, like I said, the way settler colonialism ends, by normalizing. And somehow we have to begin to monitor, the political process that Trump and Netanyahu are going back to with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, who are not friends of the Palestinians. MBS in Saudi Arabia told Anthony Blinken, I don't care about the Palestinians. I mean, he said that. So that in a way, we have to be advocates for the Palestinians, but we also really have to be sensitive to the political processes, because settler colonialism has an end. It's not just going to go on forever. And that end is normalization, and normalization is at our door. And I think this is something that I would like, there should be an international campaign against, what I call an international campaign against normalizing two-state apartheid. But so far, I have no partners. But at any rate, I think this should be our focus at this time.
Thank you, Jeff. This is such an important comment to end on. I hope that this kind of invites people to think more about this and hopefully engage with whatever campaign that you put forth in the future regarding this. So thank you so much. Thank you for
Thanks for
giving
having
us
me,
your
all
time
of you.
today.
Good to see you all.
So as we end, we don't have much time to speak on actions, but I might copy and paste before we conclude the session. But just letting everyone know, next week we'll have a Kumi relaunch, so it'll be a break period by Jeff. And after that we'll return back to our usual Kumi. So next week we don't have any Kumi, but the week after we will. So I just wanted to let everyone know that. So thank you so much for coming. And again, I'll try to copy and paste any actions. If you have any actions before you leave and want to just share it in the chat, then feel free to do so, and people can see that on their way out. So thank you, everyone.
Can I ask a very quick question?
Yes, of
Is
course.
the recording, where can we find this so I can share
Yes.
it?
So it will be, we'll usually post it a few days after on our Kumi Now YouTube. So I'll put the link to our YouTube right now in the chat, but you can just search it up. If you search up Kumi Now on YouTube, then you'll be able to find it.
Okay.
So I will put it in the chat again. And so that has also previous recordings if you want to see that. Recently we hosted Hana Thams, for example, who talks about Dapke and resistance. So we have different topics, and you can take a look at some of the old videos.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes.